sorry, we realized it my fault. We were running the wrong countdown timer. But this is actually
I was gonna say, is this the Grief and Loss podcast or the Inclusion podcast? I didn't want to say anything.
We're having a whole different topic here.
Yeah. But anyways, welcome everyone. I'm Mark. This is Crystal, and we're with M4G Advocacy Media, and you're joining us for the Under the Surface live roundtable discussion, where today our topic is inclusivity versus diversity in the disability community. Chris?
It's been really surprising how many people I've talked to, and they're like, "Oh, that's horrible. I thought that was in place. I thought those were laws, and they were definitely, nobody was having problems. But there's so much red tape we have to deal with." Sorry, he's got that like strawberry. Perfect. Live is great. So I do hydroponics, and the lights came on. It was set on a timer, and I had to take the timer off, but apparently it did loosen.
Oh, it's too bright, isn't it?
Yeah.
There you go.
That's okay. Thank you.
Got to get that lighting good.
Yeah. So so where did we want to start?
Well, I was saying that I've talked to so many people that are super surprised, and they're usually very apologetic, and they didn't realize that these things were going on. And I know you've experienced a lot with this, Danny, and I'm sure you too, Court.
Yeah, I mean, can I jump in or?
Hold on. What?
Sure.
Why is it? Can't hear you, Danny.
Okay, can you hear me now?
No.
I can hear you.
You can hear me, Court?
I can
Yeah,
hear you.
there
Can
you
you guys
go.
hear
I can
me?
hear you.
Yeah, okay. Actually, maybe before we start, maybe we just want to, can we have some introductions, I guess, for others?
Yeah.
I'm Mark. I have ataxia, genetic ataxia. Crystal.
Crystal, I have an agard ataxia.
And you guys can hear me right now?
Yeah, we can hear
Okay.
you now.
I'm Danny. I have spinal cord injury, so I use a wheelchair, and I've had this disability for 13, coming on 14 years.
And I'm Cord, and I have cerebral palsy, and I use crutches, forearm crutches, and I've had this disability since birth. And I'm 45, so for 45 years.
Sorry, I kind of interrupted Chris.
No, that's okay. I messed up because that's how we started, but we had so many technical things, and then the light threw me off.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry.
Yeah. And it's
worries.
How
It's the
just the
nature of the
little
game.
things kind of,
And that's part of, so when we deal with these things, we have to, step up, and then when other things aren't in place, then that makes our lives like twice as difficult. So just the simplest things like a light turning on is too bright, and it just drives you insane. So.
Yeah, that's so true. Access is such a crucial part of disability lifestyles, right?
Mhm.
And I think, in terms of our topic today, diversity and inclusion, diversity versus inclusion, right?
Yeah.
I think access is like the key there. That's the key to the
Absolutely.
difference between the two.
I think you're right, and I think it comes from a mindset of being able to look at your spaces and not just your concrete spaces, although that's important, but also your virtual spaces. We're in a virtual space having this discussion today, but when you look at the spaces and having the mindset to really sort of deconstruct, I mean, one of the sort of things that did come out of the pandemic was this idea that, hey, actually a lot more people could work from home than we previously thought, because from a workplace inclusion perspective, for years people with disabilities have been told, well, you absolutely have to go into the office. It is required of this job. There is no other way to do that than go to the office. And that is true for some jobs. But what we've discovered is that's not as true for every job. So that's an example of where people's mindset about that, I think, flipped a little bit, and you're seeing a lot more hybrid and virtual workspaces, which can be more inclusive to people with disabilities, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is, because again, you have to think about what does your virtual space look like. So I think it starts with the mindset that we're actually going to think about all different kinds of access.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And maybe a question for both of you. Why inclusivity versus diversity? I mean, most people think of inclusivity and diversity and they sort of lump them together. And why do you think it's important to have that definition?
That's I think this is a really interesting angle, and it stumped me for a second, but I think diversity is an adjective, right? And then inclusion is like more of an action. So I think that's the difference. Is that we're looking at diversity is sort of more descriptive, and oftentimes when we're talking about diversity, people forget about disability, right? They forget that that's even part of what a diverse, whatever it is, workforce, team, family, whatever, community, what that looks like. Um, so I think the first step is with diversity to recognize that disability exists and is part of that spectrum of
Absolutely.
diversity. And again, it's kind of just descriptive, whereas inclusion is taking an action. So
Right.
making diversity count,
Mhm.
and just just really making space for all people to excel.
Right.
I think for
So,
me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but I think for me, when I think about that, I think it's such a good question. And I think diversity is necessary, but not sufficient for inclusion, is the way that I sort of think about
no.
those. So
Mhm.
I think, when you go about diversity, it's sort of celebrating difference, but it's not necessarily saying these people belong here and we want them here. And I also think, Danny, you made a really good point that often, my background is my education is in cultural studies, and we used to talk about all kinds of different diversity and inclusion. And I was the guy often in my seminars and my graduate seminars saying, "What about people with disabilities? Like, what about us?" Right?
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think those of us with disabilities, if it's like you're talking about all these, which are good and necessary, and we need to have those conversations, but also what about us? And what does it mean? And I think just having the debate about inclusion, it forces us to say, like, what do we mean by inclusion? Because often that's become a buzzword both in sort of the business world and in higher ed. We want to be inclusive. And I think of that great scene from The Princess Bride where the character says, "You keep using that word, but I do not think it means what you think it means." But I think having the
Right.
debate about what is inclusion, right, is a good starting point to have that conversation. And that part of it is that, it's we want people here. And for me, it's giving people with disabilities and people of all abilities the tools they need in order to make choices about their lives, right? And so I think it goes beyond diversity, and it forces us to think about what is to use Danny's language, what is the action we're going to take to make sure that people are really taking part in this kind of discussion, this kind of environment.
So I was going to, can you make that big? I was going to, for our people watching that maybe can't hear us, we have some definitions, and maybe that will clarify a little bit for those people. Maybe know what we're talking about. So can you please do this? Sorry, I can't see right now. That light really threw me off. So this is the diversity. We just talked about all of that.
So diversity includes distinctions that make one person different from another. Most people understand diversity according to visible or physical differences, but there's a lot more to it.
And that's what we were just discussing, Court, with both of you are, that there's a lot more to inclusivity is not, diversity is dependent on if you're also inclusive. So, and vice versa, but more so that you need a lot more inclusivity. To be able to be diverse, you have to make sure people can get to the place you need, So, yeah.
That's such a good point. It's like, how can you even be diverse if you don't have a ramp to the stage? Let's say that. I was going to say seat at the table, but I like a ramp to the stage.
Either way, at different points in your life, often you think about high school or college, needing to be like everyone else and accept your reward on your own without somebody having to help you, because you earn that diploma yourself. And and then later on in life, you want to be included by friends, family, whoever at work, included in the conference room, in the idea, in the planning, of everything. And if you can't get in the room, or maybe it's upstairs and there's only stairs, you're automatically not included, which brings me to the point. Inclusivity derives from inclusion.
Yeah.
So can you please?
Well, I think also part of it has to be a recognition that those with disabilities are already there. Sometimes because a lot of disabilities are chronic health conditions, learning disabilities. I have a physical disability. Danny has a physical disability, but most of the disabilities you wouldn't be able to know unless somebody told you. And so there needs to be a recognition that disabilities are already there. It represents 20% of the population as a whole. So we're talking 1 out of 5. That is a large minority group that often isn't considered. So I think one of the steps or key parts of inclusion is a recognition of that people with disabilities are all around you, whether you know it or not. And some of them may feel like they have to hide the parts of themselves, the parts of their disabled identity in order to become part of that place. I work in higher ed. I work with students with disabilities. And one of the things that I tell them in the initial meeting, and I stress to my staff, is I tell them you can be as disabled as you need to be or want to choose to be in that space. Because the truth is that people with disabilities are everywhere and you may not know it. and they are, a lot of the times trying to pass as quote unquote
Yes.
able-bodied, which is, and we all do it. We all choose to do it at different points. Even those of us that are very happy about our disabled identity still make choices about that all the time. And that can be exhausting. And so there needs to be a recognition that if you have a workforce, 1 out of 5 of them is probably going to have some kind of disability, right? And so I think just a recognition that they're already around you and it's a large minority is an important part of that conversation as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I had a conversation with somebody the other day who was really surprised to hear that statistic, because I think now I've even seen 1 in 4 going around as sort of the go-to. There's a couple, Washington Post has quoted that statistic.
And I wouldn't be surprised if it was more than that.
Yeah, and so right, and I think this woman who doesn't have a lot of exposure to disability, disability discourse, let's say. She doesn't have a lot of exposure to that. She was surprised by this statistic. She was like, it can't be there can't be so many of them. And I'm like, well, we're all not Christopher Reeves, like the media pictures us, right?
Yeah, right.
And the other thing is that I said, I think a huge percentage of those people in that statistic, they do not self-identify as having a disability. And there's many reasons to that, right? There's not a space for it. There are attitudinal barriers. There are consequences to taking on that identity. I mean, some people see it as a negative. I mean, there's a spectrum of attitudes towards taking on the identifier, right? But it's interesting how I really think inclusion is enhanced by creating a space for the disability identity, right? Where you can have a safe place, as Court said, to be as disabled as you are, right? You don't need to try to pass, or you can just be yourself.
Right.
So
You bring up a good point, and I've certainly dealt with this many times in, the workforce and in people in general, where they are just so uncomfortable with the situation that we feel we need to maybe hide some of our disability, and then those skills that we have aren't there because we're, scared of how we're going to move or how we're going to act or how we're going to look, things like that. And that's really sad. We need places to be more accepting of who we are.
I have a little anecdote that could help kind of illustrate. Court, you brought up the fact that you work in higher education with people with disabilities, and when I was a student in grad school, I think it was recognized that I added value to their diversity on campus, right? But I consulted with the DRC on campus, which was the Disability Resource Center. I think all colleges are required to have those. Correct me if I'm wrong, Court. But they were really helpful with setting me up with the tools I needed to be able to participate fully as a student on campus. But the problem was that there were professors I had that saw that the allowances and the tools that I was given, they saw those as unfair and as unfair advantages. For example, I had to go take my tests, my written exams, at a separate facility so that I could use voice recognition. And I needed extra time because I have personal issues that I don't feel like sharing with my professors that have to do with,
And
let's
they
say,
shouldn't.
bathroom things. And so I was given these accommodations that gave me extra time on exams. And some of my professors did not like that. They were aware of it, and they would make passive aggressive comments towards me. And I really was concerned that when they were grading my papers, that they would think of that and have like a bias, right? So it's wild how, we can make these systemic changes, implement these systems where we're saying we're being inclusive because we have a DRC at this college and they're giving the student the tools. But when the people in power don't understand disability, then what's the point? Right? So I think there needs to be a lot of education at the highest levels possible.
Right.
I think that is a huge part of the conversation, and I thank you for sharing that. And I had similar things. I graduated undergraduate in 2000, went to college and all the way back in 1996, and I am, and Danny might be as well, we're considered sort of the post-ADA generation. The Americans with Disabilities Act is passed. I was in 7th grade. It became law. I was just starting high school, right? So that's how recent we're talking about in terms of, it's this landmark civil rights law for people with disabilities. It's not that old, right? This is it became law in 92. It's only been passed for 32 years. It's only officially been law for 30 years. And so that's not that much. And so there were a lot of professors back when I was an undergraduate, and some of them who, felt the same way. And there are some employers who feel that, right? That if we hire a bunch of people with disabilities and we give them accommodations in the workplace, they won't be as productive. But what we know, if you actually look at the data, is that people with disabilities end up being, if properly accommodated and included, the most loyal, the most productive workers, right? They're good at dealing. Like, one of the things that helps people with disabilities, a lot of us are good at dealing with when things don't go well. I always joke that every college campus, everybody complains about parking. That's just one of the rules of higher education. Doesn't matter where you work. Students and faculty are never happy with parking. And I don't drive. I use a bus system, and I always have to laugh at my able-bodied colleagues when I'm like, I don't think you could ride my bus for like 2 weeks, right, and wait for the amount of time.
Right.
But what it does is it teaches you you learn how to deal with things that maybe aren't ideal, and that helps you in the workplace. So, okay, this thing didn't go well. How do we adjust? So it's part of the inclusion conversation is actually like moving the conversation beyond its inclusion being something able-bodied people do for people with disabilities, but rather recognizing that people with disabilities are here, that we just want the access so that we can be productive members of your workplace, of your school, of your community, so that we can take part in all aspects of the life and make those choices. And it's not something that you're doing for us. It's something that if you do will enhance your families, your communities, your schools, and your workplaces. And it's understanding that concept and moving that education piece beyond, I've been an instructor as well, and I can tell you I'm supposed to be an expert in this. And sometimes, having a person with a certain kind of disability in a class that I've never had before makes me a better instructor, because I have to think about, how am I going to do this thing I've always done a certain way? How am I going to do it differently? And it can really enhance everybody's perspective. And I think that's something that we need to have in this inclusion debate, is that inclusion is not something that able-bodied people do for people with disabilities, as if they're doing something for us, as if they're achieving something that we shouldn't have. And by doing it, it's going to make not only our lives better, but their lives better as well. Because how many times have you been at the grocery store and you see people using sliding doors or push button doors when you go shopping? Like, those kind of things enhance quality of life for everybody. That's like a small example.
Mhm. So I've worked from home for years, right? As a graphic designer and a web designer. Okay, well, I dealt with so many things in the workplace of the biases, and let's talk about tokenism. Okay, so we just need to check off a box. You're here, great, yay. Okay, well, yeah, that worked for so long, only because I needed to. So I needed the income to supplement what anyway. But so that was the only reason I ever needed it. But him and I were talking about, so many people after the pandemic specifically, but disabled people have been working from home for years if they can work, and there's a lot more now, you know. But uh, and that begs the question, yes, there's a lot more advances in technology and being able to do things like this. But, I would, if I was a CEO or some higher, in a job or something, I would be worried about everybody that could be working for me is working but for themselves. So,
And to add to that's a valid point, and to add to it, technological advances are great and progress is great, but if we don't advance our attitudes and progress our
right.
feelings towards other people and the way we treat them, then it doesn't matter if you have like some rocket ship that can fly to the moon
Mhm.
if you can just treat people
Right.
like.
Exactly. It's kind of like, you know, if you've been treated a certain way for so long, you're like, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to take it. I don't have to be around this anymore. I'm
Hmm.
going to go work for myself. And so, that brings up the point to where disabled people are like, we're tired of this. So collectively, right now, I'm seeing a lot of disabled people like, no, I'm not doing that anymore. And so,
No.
yeah, companies are totally like, we need to get all in the ball here. We need to be diverse. We need to be inclusive.
Hmm.
But they're using the two. So
Hmm.
we're hoping to be able to maybe straighten some of that stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's really important to distinguish. And just going off on a little tangent, it made what you said just made me wonder how many disabled people become entrepreneurs when they're just like,
No,
F it, I can't do this job because
no,
people don't
for
aren't
for other
accommodating.
show,
And
for
yeah.
the other show, the journey you're going to be on next month. We're going to start off the year with you, I think. Um, but so we do a lot of research for guests and stuff.
Hmm.
You have no idea how many people we've researched that are like, hey, I'm doing this thing and I'm doing this thing and I'm not. I have very little help. I can do it. So it's surprising,
Yeah.
but
Hmm.
it's not surprising, but it's sad.
Yeah, it's energizing and empowering, but at the same time, like Crystal said, it's sad and depressing that that's the only option. Like if you're somebody on disability going through the standard stuff and going through the whole education employment pipeline or conveyor belt or whatever you want to call it, um, that there's no option for you. Like you're gonna have to. It's gonna be extremely hard to find an employer who is has the right attitude to make those accommodations and want to make those accommodations. Nobody wants to work for somebody that is making accommodations because they feel they have to, and sort of in a passive aggressive manner, don't really feel like you deserve it, or no, or you're taking handouts or whatever they want to say.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that's an important part for people with disabilities to think about. It's one of the reasons I ended up sort of in higher ed, because I felt like it was one of the places that is, although not perfect, maybe more inclusive than other sectors, right? Where particularly with my job as a director of disability services, where my disability could be seen as a benefit directly to the job, right? As opposed to this hindrance, we have to do this thing for this individual. And I think, it's also educating employers on the value. And again, it starts even with the basic language. One of the things that has always struck me, if you go to a thesaurus and you look up synonyms for the word disabled, what you find will horrify you, because you'll see words like weak, pathetic, useless. And so when that's at the base of our language, right, where disability is equated with inability, right, or not ability to sort of function, to sort of have these sort of, quote unquote typical, I don't like the term normal, but these typical sort of experiences. It's also a notion, in my work, I've often studied the concept of hegemony, which is this idea of ideologies that become so pervasive that people buy into them, whether they realize they're doing it or not. And there certainly is a hegemony that able-bodied is the preferred way that you're supposed to navigate the world. But the truth is that if you read the literature in the field of disability studies and other academic literature, what you discover is that able-bodiedness is a temporary condition. There's a term in the literature known as temporarily able-bodied, right? I always joke that, look, people with who are able-bodied are one banana peel from being where I am, or one change in experiences from being where I am, and recognizing the fluid nature of ability that comes and goes. I mean, how many of those of us with physical disabilities have had that friend that, like, I use crutches, you have that friend or that acquaintance that they become injured, they use crutches for a while, and they tell you, like, oh man, I had no idea, right? Because again, ableness is a fluid part of human nature. It's not the normal part of human nature. People come in and out of being able to do certain things and not others throughout various points in their life. And so I think having that education and that conversation around sort of disability as a beautiful part of the human condition that makes us amazing and beautiful and powerful is a part way to have that conversation. And again, really stressing to people that if you do inclusion well and you make people feel welcome, it's not something that has to be extra, but these individuals will then value you. And that's inclusion on all types, whether we're talking about race, gender, LGBT issues, disability, whatever it is, that people will then, really work for you, really be part of your communities, and it will enhance everybody's experience. And,
hello,
that's
friends.
Something we think of.
Hi, Anthony.
Hi, guys. I'm gonna. Sorry to interrupt. Real quick, I'm just gonna step out for a second. Let my dogs out. Be right back.
Sure. Anthony,
Hi, Anthony.
can't hear you. There you go. Huh?
Hi, Anthony. Oh, can you hear us?
Testing the speakers.
Also, we'll just take a short break while we wait for Anthony and Danny to come back.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
we can
now
hear
we
you.
can.
Okay, all right, I figured it out. Okay.
Glad
Everybody
you could
doing?
make it. This is Court and Danny.
Hello,
and of
folks.
course,
Nice
you
to
know
meet you.
myself and Crystal.
Nice to meet you guys.
Thank you for joining
Nice to
us.
meet you.
And we're just unpacking inclusivity and sort of what could you remind us of the point you were finishing on the Court?
No, I was just saying, previously that I think, you know, we have to start the conversation with that disability is actually part of the beautiful human condition, not the thing that happens to the beautiful able-bodied body, but rather it is part of the limited fluid nature which we live in the world, right? Like part of what makes being human special is that we don't live forever, right? Like that we are frail, that we are, and I think that's why we struggle to talk about inclusivity when it relates to people with disabilities, because I think more than any other sort of category that's normally talked about in diversity slash inclusion or diversity versus inclusion circles, that disability reminds people of human frailty, and that makes people, I think, fundamentally uncomfortable. But to me, that makes us fundamentally human. And so to me, when I think of the fundamental human spiritual experience, I think of disability as part and parcel of that, right? And I think framing disability not as the thing that happens to the able-bodied experience, but as part of the human condition that we all experience, because ableness is temporary in its nature, I think is hugely important.
Court.
Exactly.
I love everything you said. I think it's just such a great. I wish that more people could understand these sort of abstract concepts, and you really made them easy to understand. So thank you for that. And Mark, to your point about attitudes being really one of the biggest barriers. It doesn't matter how much technology we have. At the end of the day, if the attitudes are still there, who cares, right? Like I think, and one of the things that I do personally, with my interactions with people, through in the workplace, as a mom, taking my kids to school, wherever I am, I try to show people that I try to flip the script on disability, right? Like I I've started, like, for example, I've started a business lately, and I'm referring to it as disability led. So I'm offering a service. It's a service. I can't talk about it right now because I'm still formulating this business, but I offer a service, and I refer to it as disability led. Because do people ever put those two words together? Usually not. And we need to start doing it. And we need to start seeing more people with disabilities in leadership positions.
And people don't use that terminology because it has a negative connotation to it. So why would they advertise that? You know, but if we make it more of a norm, you know, and people are able to recognize what disabled people are about, and what they can achieve, and what they can do in the workforce as well, then it will be the norm. But until people recognize those things, they're going to continue acting and doing this and thing and not putting laws into place. What do you think, Anthony?
Yeah, well, I apologize for the tardiness on my part. I was just finishing work. I'm from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. I actually created a brand called Above and Beyond, bridging the gap to accessibility and inclusion. I'm an author, an actor, speaker, host, and consultant on accessibility and inclusion. And I like the whole aspect in the conversation that has been spearheaded by Mark and Crystal about the semblance of inclusion. You know, inclusion is something so misunderstood, but sheepishly misunderstood in the sense that inclusion really amplifies economy, amplifies leadership, amplifies community, amplifies transportation, amplifies the environment. When we build with accessibility and inclusion, there is a win for everybody. Honestly, that gets overlooked and overshadowed so many times, by elitist, by ableism, and that's what has been spoken about since I've been here. We need to eradicate the ableism. We need to eradicate the fact that people with disabilities are deemed negative when it's simply about an opportunity. In Hamilton, the percentage of people with disabilities is greater than the provincial and national averages. So to me, that's an abundance of potential. That's an abundance of opportunity, and we need to share our skills and what we have as members of the disability community. There's over 1.1 billion people worldwide that identify as members of the disability community. So much untapped potential that has gone underserved for way too long. We had just gone through International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and I really hope that going forward, people with disabilities are treated with respect and dignity and independence and have our quality of life as we choose to see fit, not something that is gate kept for us. I'm sorry. I'm good.
And you've done some awesome work in making sure those things are happening and makes it going forward. And we really appreciate that.
No, I love what you said, Anthony, and particularly about choice. Again, when I think about inclusion, I think about choice. And one of the other pieces is not only do we need to educate people who are able-bodied, but we also need to educate with the people with disabilities about how to communicate about their disability. I call it powerful literacy, that so many times people with disabilities have accommodations or have needs and are not given the space to learn how to communicate and advocate for themselves. So part of the education is also working with people with disabilities and their families to give people with disabilities the space to learn to make mistakes, because that's part of advocacy, right? One of the things that I find frustrating in the disability world is we give able-bodied people the chance to fail at something that might be difficult for them all the time, but oftentimes we don't afford that same opportunity to those with disabilities. But that can be how you can learn, right? Like, okay, I couldn't do this, or I couldn't do it this way, but I can do it this way. So I think also, creating spaces where we can really help mentor those younger people with disabilities. And I say that because I'll never forget this experience. When I started my career, I started at community college in Ohio, and I had a student who said to me, "I think you're inspirational." And that always makes me uncomfortable. I don't like when people say that about me. And so I kind of got this weird look on my face, which she could tell. And she goes, no, it's not what you think. And she goes, "You're the first person with a disability who has a job, and people have to call you doctor, and you look like me. And you're the first person who remotely looks like me, because this individual used forearm crutches in a wheelchair, that has a job." And that always struck me, that there are not enough mentors that are easily accessible to other people with disabilities, where they can learn from those that have been down the path that they are traveling. And I think that's something too, is how do we create those spaces as part of this inclusion? So companies thinking about ways in which people with disabilities are given the tools, and communities given the tools to learn about themselves and their disabilities and how to navigate the world around them.
Great point, Court. I think also what can be added to that is a big part of empowering people and teaching them how to be advocates is sort of undoing what's been done to them in the, I think the word you mentioned was hegemony, where people, they've grown up their whole lives, and disability is talked about in family gatherings or in work settings in certain ways. And that's just built up these walls that are incredibly hard to break down for someone who isn't used to talking that way about themselves, because they've been constantly looked down upon their whole life.
Or another thing is if somebody else in the family is also is disabled, and then somebody acquires that disability, there's already a preset notion of how they're going to be looked at, right? Mm-hmm. How they're going to be perceived and how they're going to be talked to or talked down to, or talked about, whatever, you know. So already you don't feel good about yourself because of you have disability. So that doesn't set anybody up for success.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are at a point where societies deem people with disabilities as a negative, as a burden. And we need to eradicate that attitudinal barrier of people with disabilities are an asset. And when we build with accessibility and inclusion in mind, we all collectively prosper. You know, the diversity and the inclusion, as has been mentioned, is such a valuable um, point or a value stake in what we have to offer. You know, as you know, as I build my brand, as I build the community that's around me. I literally just ran for city council in the last election. I wasn't successful. I finished third, but I got that point out of accessibility. I got that point out of inclusion, and it's so important that accessibility and inclusion be talked about at the forefront of the conversation, not an afterthought. You can't build
Right.
with accessibility and inclusion at the end. You need to build it from with accessibility and inclusion at the forefront of the conversation. Far too often, you know, we are given that proverbial baby talk. Far too often, we are put in positions where people without disabilities are doing something to quote unquote support the disabled community and are seeking validation. And they're doing it after the fact rather than doing it with us in consultation with, so that we can do it right from the start. Oftentimes, we are retrofitting accessibility into a pre-existing build, and that's really where we are, and that's really a problem this stage of the game.
I think the way you put it, Anthony, when you think about it, is how can we be proactive? I love what you said, rather than reactive. And I think that that's an important part. And one of those conversations is, you know, as from a physical space, but even from a virtual space, sometimes there's a difference between something that is up to code and something that is actually usable, right? For example, right? So it's like asking the people in wheelchairs who are actually going to be using the ramps, right? To like, is this what's the rise of a run or the bathrooms or whatever it is? The other example that I always find funny, and this isn't how you can kind of tell what the mindset of your institution is. If you ever go to a place and they're busy, like after it snows, right? They're busy salting the stairs and making sure the stairs are clear, but they don't get to the ramps. And you point out to them, you know, if you like cleared the ramp, then everybody could get in, including those who would use the stairs because they could walk up the ramp. So like you could actually double everybody who could get in. But like the thought process is I've got to do the stairs first and then the ramp is the afterthought. But my thought is like part of what you're talking about, Anthony, is that mindset. This is what you mean by enhancing. If you think to yourself, hey, if I cleared the ramp, then I know everybody can get in, right, while I work on the stairs, rather than vice versa. But too often it happens vice versa.
Or if you happen to run out of salt doing the stairs, then you kind of you don't cover everyone. Whereas if you just have enough salt to get through the ramp, you don't have to worry, really. Kind of got stuck there.
You want to go to the next point?
Sure.
Well, Anthony, you weren't here, but my hydroponics lights came on, and it messed up my whole vision. So I'm like, Mark, you do my job.
Oh, I know.
So
Just speaking to the whole semblance of accessibility and inclusion, what we're doing right now, the technology, if this wasn't more advanced and where people could work from home, far too often more people with disabilities would be employed. You know, cue the pandemic, everybody works from home. It's, hey, look, you know, I guess it works for people with disabilities now. It shouldn't take a catastrophe like the pandemic for this kind of things to happen. It often is So, like, I mean, the Brady Bunch got it right. They were the first Zoom call. Let's call it like it is. But understand the fact that we can do this now, and it is so seamlessly, which means people with disabilities can work from home, because everybody can work from home. But understanding the fact that people with disabilities can become more employable, the access and the inclusion can be more prevalent because of the technology and the advancements of technology, just like this.
So the next point we wanted to sort of unpack here is that fear and silence enable us and create implicit bias. What do you think about that quote, Anthony?
I think for me, I think this is true. And I think, again, it goes back to, are people given the tools they need to feel confident about communicating about their disability, right? In a way that empowers them to talk about it. And I think too often people are afraid because they're not sure what to say, right? They have something that they want to say or they need to say, but they're not sure how to say it. So I think, one of the things becomes, do people with disabilities, and this is a question I'm always asking myself in my job, because as I said, I work with students who have disabilities, like, do my students have the tools they need to communicate effectively about what they need and why they need it, right? And that is a huge part of this, is that people oftentimes are silent because they're afraid, like, if I speak up and I don't say the right thing, people are, and they also don't know who do I talk to about this, right? Because my argument is, you shouldn't tell everybody this, because unfortunately we don't live in a world where everybody's agenda is going to be your agenda, but there are people in your communities and your companies that you do need to tell. So part of this is learning how to navigate the system in an effective way that can overcome sort of that silence, and encouraging companies to clearly lay out from an employment perspective, for example, like, how do I do this? Because oftentimes if you're looking at a company's website, it's not clear, like, well, how do I go about this? What's the process? And it can seem overwhelming. So trying to lay out for people what is the process and is it easily understandable?
Yeah.
When you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. One size does not fit all. There's an individual education plan. There's a confidential academic accommodation plan. When you deal with in the education system with instructors and your disability services division, that is a contractual agreement between students, that staff member, and instructors to provide what that student needs to level the playing field, to be more equitable. It's not to give that student an advantage, it's to provide that equitable nature behind what that education plan provides for that student. Far too often, that gets prejudiced and biased behavior and ableist bias. Well, so and so with an invisible disability. Well, why do they need that? There's this back and forth kind of cutthroat conversation. Well, they don't look like they need that, or they have a physical disability. So why do they need that? Well, and this is what prolongs the solution.
And to that point, Anthony, um, how much of uh, I'm talking disabled people's fear and silence about speaking up and being their own advocates and seeking the accommodations they need, how much of that is reliant on the sort of overwhelming nature or the intimidating nature of having to explain why you need things and justify that you do need them and explain and give a litany of paperwork to back up your claims
Yep.
and basically prove that you are disabled and you are deserving of fair treatment. And,
It is condescending, it's demoralizing and dehumanizing to have to go through the barriers just for a quality of life. We all deserve a quality of life that we choose. The fact that it's gate kept against us, the fact that it's pressed up against us as an ableist through ableism, and the fact that when people push at you you want to push back, but then there's this fear and silence that you guys are alluding to, that, can I push back? Do I have the strength and the courage to push back? Then yeah, that's what you need to do. You need to push back. It's easier said than done. Don't get me wrong, but it's building up the strength and the confidence within yourself to know what your quality of life looks like. Don't let others define your quality of life. You define it by who you are.
Yeah, it's also really hard when you're in the workplace or in public, when things are done or said and people just laugh it off or, bury it, push it under the rug, whatever. And then they just don't even, they don't even want to discuss it and kind of just laugh it off. And then it creates a negative bias toward people with disabilities.
I mean, I think that's 100% it can seem overwhelming. I'm going to use an anecdote from my own life. The paperwork thing. I love what you said about the paperwork thing. So as I said, I use a special bus system, and every 3 years I have to verify that I still need the bus. And it's like, can I just walk in with my crutches and can that be enough? Right? It's annoying that I have to go to my doctor and pay $25 so that they can fill out a paperwork going, yes, he's had cerebral palsy his entire life. He's used crutches since he's 8 years old. And yes, he still uses them and would struggle to use a regular bus, right? Like those kinds of things that people constantly have to do, that constant negotiation can seem overwhelming and intimidating, but I think it also can be empowering. One of the things that I often say is, like, you have to start to see your disability as a privilege, and you have certain rights, and like seeing it as like, this is a privilege, I'm going to assert my rights, right? I give a Spider-Man speech: with great power comes great responsibility. Right. Sorry, I like Marvel movies. And so when we think about ways to communicate, it's letting people know that these conversations are normal, and also that one of the things we know about the generation coming up, right, is that this is the most at-risk generation in terms of mental health issues, right? And so the numbers of people with disabilities are going to grow, and probably some of that has been exacerbated by some technology, things like social media, the pandemic, all sorts of cultural factors that have played a role and are going to continue to play a role. Like, people with disabilities are here, again, over 20% of the population. Some numbers, as you guys have pointed out, have it higher, but it could get even higher. And as we think about the baby boom generation, for example, in the United States getting older, right? And they're becoming disabled as they move into sort of a different stage in their life, right? When we think about those kind of things, it's having this conversation that this is, again, a part of the human condition, and making sure that we're at the table and beyond the token, but that we're at the table having real kind of conversations about what our individual spheres look like, and creating opportunities where people with disabilities can be truthful about their experiences. Because sometimes when you are a person with disability, you're like, well, if I ask for this accommodation from my boss or my supervisor, are they going to give me a bad evaluation? This, that, the other. There's always that worry. So I think, continuing to train managers of people who are hiring managers that work with people with disabilities, continuing to train people, starting with the young age. Because one of the things that leads to this is that we teach kids very early on not to talk about difference in disability very often. The number of times that I've been in a store or a mall and a kid who's just curious comes up and says, hey, why do you walk like that? And they don't think it's good or bad. It's just different than what they're used to. And the parent instantly grabs them and says, don't look at them. Don't talk. Don't do that. What that teaches or reinforces for the kid is, whatever that thing was on crutches, I'm not supposed to talk about it. And so by the time that these individuals who are children who've been socialized this way reach adulthood, they cannot effectively communicate about these issues. So I think also creating space for younger people to learn how to talk about disability in helpful ways, so that as they become adults, right? What are we doing in the primary schooling, the K through 12 schooling, the primary schooling in Canada? What are we doing to help younger people understand these differences as well, so that as they grow up, they're more comfortable talking about these topics?
Yeah.
Diversity is being at the table, inclusion is being asked to speak, and belonging is having your voice actually heard. And when
Right.
people with disabilities are at the table, there is strength in numbers, and disability is the only demographic, as you just alluded to, with a fluctuation rate. Anything could happen to anyone at any time. The fact that we
Right.
wait reactively, the fact that we wait for an oops to actually want to do something about it, is the stigma that needs to change and needs to change now.
Right. So that brings up a good point. Um, in talking about, as Court was saying, the generation coming up, Gen Z, and then we have our boomer parents, so, and we're in a position, people like us are in a position to say, hey, this is no, we're not doing this anymore. These are our kids are coming up, our parents are getting older, and we're going to create a world for them, hopefully, that if something, God forbid, happens to them, or they just age, they're going to be able to be included and feel accepted in things.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm
Sure.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I do think for all we do have a long way to go. There's no doubt about that. But I also would say I think we have come a long way as well, right? I do think that in the last 3 decades we have made tremendous progress, and it's cool that we can even have a podcast about this and a place where we can actually have these conversations, which a couple of decades ago, obviously with the technology, would have been unthinkable. So I think, but I think the piece now is, okay, we've got the legal infrastructure in place. What now needs to change, and what's harder to change, is the perception. Because what I always say is you can't change 5,000 years of history in Western culture anyway, in terms of how disabilities have been framed historically negatively, and that it's going to go away in 30 years, right? 3 decades, because you pass some laws. And we know, like, employment's a perfect example, right? Like, despite the Americans with Disabilities Act being passed, for example, too many people with disabilities remained outside of their communities, isolated and alone, and that's not okay, right? And so we have a long way. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. But I do think that people like us having these conversations is a good place to keep going and keep bringing these issues up, and also letting people with disabilities know that there are people out there who care about you, who want to help you, and that you can make the choices. As was said earlier, you can empower yourself. Sometimes when you're a person with disability, you feel like you're an extra in a movie, like you're kind of watching your world go by, but you're not an active player in it, right? Like you're not the main, you're not Brad Pitt, you're just the guy at the cafe that Brad Pitt's character is, right? But like, it's learning that you actually do have agency over some things. And so again, having a conversation with folks about what are the things you can control and what are the things that are beyond your control, and really understanding that you do have some agency, and us as a group of people with disabilities figuring out how we empower those who have agency to even have more agency in their everyday lives, I think, is the challenge.
Yeah, and you talked about the ADA. In Ontario, we have the AODA, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and I think far too many companies, organizations, businesses, governments think about the word compliance. And I have a love-hate relationship with that word compliance, because people think it's okay to meet a minimum standard. Essentially, when you're being compliant, you're meeting a minimum standard. And I, for one, am not a minimum standard. We need to think about ways to exceed what the ADA, the AODA refers to. We have the technology, we have the resources. It's great when we put those resources to good use proactively to ensure that ADA, AODA is exceeding what a minimum benchmark looks like. Because other than like for that, like to me, it just means that people are just content with let's maintain compliancy, let's attain compliance. Well, no, let's exceed it. Let's we have the resources. Let's exceed it. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs when we have to force these compliances and these guidelines on people in order to them for them to treat people like human beings and allow them to or make them do the stuff they should be doing anyways.
We were listening to a TED talk earlier about diversity and inclusion, and she was mentioning that she brought up a good point. Like, if I was having a birthday party or I was planning a party or planning, like, I almost 15 years ago, I planned my sister's wedding shower, and so when you're planning something like that, you have to find somewhere accessible, right? And not for them, but for you, to make sure. And anybody else they want to invite that might be in a wheelchair or need a ramp, right? Well, okay, so if I'm making a reservation and having a birthday party, then I'm going to need to be one of the people, and the other 14 people are going to need to go. That's going to be more money for your business. But if I can't get in, I'm not even going to make the reservation there. So you would think that economically that would be a smart move for a business to make sure you can get in the door.
Far too often, the semblance is of cost, as you just alluded to, Crystal. But what about investment? The return on investment is invaluable to the business, to the corporation, to the community. The return on investment will pay for it in itself in spades because you are allowing more access, more inclusion. You're allowing people to be shoppers at a mall. You're allowing people to be employed. That will boost the economy. And the economic will rise. The supply and demand will rise. You're allowing people to live a quality of life. You're allowing autonomy. You're allowing agency. You're allowing dignity. You're allowing respect for that person because you did something proactively, let's hope, for a ramp, to be put a ramp in place. And you are giving that person that space to belong. And when something is partially accessible or not accessible at all, underlying message is you don't belong here. I hate to be blunt, but it's the truth.
Yep.
Well, I think that's the other point to you make with this is not only can I get in the building, but then beyond that, what am I going to be? How am I going to be perceived when I get into the building, right? And how am I going to be treated when I get into the building? And how are in some ways, people who have invisible disabilities have it tough because people, when they see me on crutches, they at least know, okay, that's a legitimate disability in their minds, right? Because when we think about disability in context, we often think of parking spaces or people that look like me. But again, most people don't look like me that are dealing with disabilities and struggling to navigate the able-bodied world that's not built for them. And part of their struggle in navigating that able-bodied world not built for them is that people don't see their chronic health condition, their learning disability, as a legitimate disability, right? And I think that is the challenge. We have certain disabilities that we know are quote unquote the real ones, and then other ones that people that don't think are real. And the truth is that, again, all people with disabilities, whether they're visible or not, are dealing with a world that's not built for them. And that's really the key to this, is that our struggle as people with disabilities isn't because of our disabilities. It's because we have certain realities of our physical body that are limited based on the world that is constructed and built around that, whether that's how we're treated, whether that's the expectations on the job, whether that's how workspace or communities are constructed. It's how things are built. And so we need to have that conversation about how do you build a space where people are included and welcomed and can navigate that space in an equitable and effective way.
And to your
That's
point, I'll
good.
just add on to it. Not only how do you build a space, how do you maintain a space? How do you sustain a space's longevity to be accessible and inclusive? When something breaks down, are you going to take a week to fix it? Or is it going to be considered a priority to fix, like an elevator, for example? If stairs just automatically crumble, you're going to take that as a priority to fix because the majority of people within your business and within your community require the stairs. But if an elevator breaks down, you'll hear the semblance of, oh, we're just waiting for a part. It's going to take a week and whatnot. It's good. But because the majority of your consumers, let's use the business example at this point, that aren't impacted, it's going to take longer for that elevator to get fixed versus a set of stairs.
And further to that, let me turn off the light.
Sorry, guys. I know I set these timers to come on and go off when we do journeys, right? Because we finish working usually about 4. So I set them there, but then when we do under the surface, right? That's 3, 4 o'clock could be under 4:35 o'clock sometimes.
Yeah, and then lights come on and
So I
it
think
kind of
I
throws
think
us
that's
off.
it. should be.
I was going to add further to your point, Anthony, is that from a business perspective, anyways, people should also factor in that disabled people aren't just maybe aren't just going to a business or restaurant or whatever by themselves. They may be bringing family and friends, and anything that is done to exclude that disabled person also excludes the people that may be coming along with them or belong to their peer group.
Right.
Yeah, and speaking to the semblance of ableism and using your restaurant, for example, I was at some restaurant with some friends, at a restaurant with some friends, and the waiter waitress circles the table, and they come to me, and they turn to my friend and they'll ask, well, what will he have? I said, a talk with your manager. So we needed to get that point across that like we're people too. Like, I mean, yeah, in being able to utilize the services that establishment offers. It's not accessible when you can go to the restaurant and eat, but you can't go to the bathroom because it's down the stairs and there's no elevator. That's functional.
Right.
It's not acceptable or not accessible when you can't utilize the same services as an able-bodied person would with equity, dignity, and with respect.
And that gets back to the inclusive piece. I think we've all had that experience of the that happens to me and my wife on occasions. Where again, we're in an interability relationship. I have an obvious disability, she does not, and it's she sometimes will get the what will he have to order, and those kind of things. And so it's again, how are we treating these people? And again, that gets back to the education piece. What are we doing to talk about disability in a way that's helping people understand that, again, it's a part of the human condition and a positive part of the human condition, not a negative one. And I think that, again, we've said it a number of times in this podcast, but I think that is an important thing to to really focus on is that an education piece of getting these individuals and keep not just educate them when they're in elementary school and teach them about disability, but continue to teach them about age appropriate things about the experience of people with disabilities, I think is something that needs to continue. Sometimes it's okay, we'll go to some elementary schools or we'll go into high schools, but there's not that continuous discussion, right? Are there opportunities to include, concepts of disability in college curriculums, right? Where again, we're continuing that educational experience, because these individuals are going to be the hiring managers, the co-workers, the colleagues that we're going to have, right? So thinking about ways that we can build an educational experience for people as they move through different phases of their education and move into adulthood, so it just doesn't become the thing that we may do once or twice, but it becomes part of the educational experience of people, so that they don't talk to the person who doesn't have the disability instead of the person who has the disability, right? That they don't have that people like Anthony and myself don't then have that experience. Or I'm sure it's happened to you both, Mark and Crystal, that you guys don't have that experience, right? So continuing that education piece.
Lived
Yeah.
experience doesn't get the notoriety nor the respect that it deserves. Often gets overlooked and swept under the rug as an afterthought. And that needs to change. I always say that I don't tout perfection, I celebrate progression. It's never going to be perfect, but we need to build progression. We need to build momentum to a greater, accessible, and inclusive world.
I love that point, Anthony, because it makes me think sometimes people will say when you talk to them, well, I can't do this perfectly, so I'm not going to do it. And I have this phrase that I use all the time, which is never let perfect be the enemy of good. And sometimes people are like, and I think that's what you're getting at, like, in a perfect world, it would be X, Y, and Z, but we're not even to the good part yet for people with disabilities. So can we just get to the good and not let, perfect be the enemy of good? If we can do something to progress, to make it better, let's do that. Let's continue to work forward. Yes, we've got to keep working. It's a continuing battle. It's a continuing struggle. We've got to keep molding the world, maintaining the world. I love that you said that earlier. But just understand that those realities, I think, are important.
Sorry.
Success without failure is not success at all. Success with failure leads to greater prosperity.
Yeah, I think it's also a problematic thing when, the older generations is, mm, are so um, set in their ways and don't want to see change happen. They're comfortable the way they are. And so people like us coming in and saying, hey, those things that were happening, they helped you and they fit your narrative and your needs, but they're not working for us. So, and I think that needs to be considered as well. It's not all their fault. I mean, that's what they had, that's what they knew to do, that's what their parents taught them, and the people that taught them in the education system taught them how to treat disabled people. And back then, it was a lot worse. But when the laws were put in place and they're not actually in place, somewhat, only somewhat, that kind of tells you something. Unless the people should notice, hey, that didn't actually work, and we need to make these things happen.
Nothing about us without us. Far too often, people try to initiate change, but the only consistency in life is inconsistency. And when you have that abundance of talent at the table being part of change, you get it right more often, and you don't have to spend the extra money retrofitting or admitting that you failed on the first try. Transportation, for example. There's an abundance of vehicles on the road that support people with disabilities in terms of paratransit, but the procurement of vehicles happens, after the fact, and then they go to the disability community and say, "Well, how do we do?" In a sense, seeking validation rather than seeking respect for doing it because it's already been done. Getting it right and getting it done and being inclusive from the start is where the transition needs to go.
Um, what do you think, Cord?
I mean, I do think it starts with the mindset of, again, planning, thinking about disability as a part of the space, whether that's a community space, an educational space, a workspace, a family space that you are creating, and how do you build that space rather than, again, being proactive rather than reactive, and thinking about it from that perspective. And again, it starts with the idea. I think the only way that happens is it starts with the idea of we want people with disabilities to be part of the community, and that, again, as I've said before, that we're not doing things for the people with disabilities, right? We're doing things with the people with disabilities, and it's not like you shouldn't feel great or like that we're doing this for you, but that you are part of our community, and we want to build a community that includes you. Because if you build a community that includes everyone, then that would be a great example at a more inclusive place. A small example, getting back to our kind of restaurant example, there are a lot of restaurants, sports bars, those type of places that have a lot of high top tables, right? Where it's all high tops. Well, people with wheelchairs, people who are little people who might have different heights might struggle in those kinds of, environments. And so, like, but people often don't think when they're having events at a place, like, are there any low tables where people with disabilities can actually sit, or is this one of those places that has nothing but high tops and all the low top tables are down with chairs that aren't accessible, right? So thinking about people with disabilities when you're planning an event, I think it really, inclusion comes down to a mindset that just stopping to think about, different types of disabilities, of other kind of minority experiences, and how can we create spaces that let people be the best versions of themselves and give them the equitable experience to be there and to truly take part, not just to be there and on the side and in the corner, but actually be where the action is. And part of that I think is, a really important thing that's necessary, that's often not considered, because again, we're always reacting to the disability instead of thinking about it as we're doing something.
I remember I was at a hotel room with my girlfriend at the time, and the bed had the box spring. So without a catapult, like I wouldn't be able to get on the bed. And Court, I just want to piggyback off your thought of IDEA. I've always used the term IDEA as an acronym: inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility. And isn't it a good idea when we think of those four pillars from the start? Over to you guys.
And I think asking the question, what does it look like? And really having those kind of deep conversations about, I think that's good to have four pillars. And I often say that inclusion isn't always coming up with the right answers, but asking yourselves the right questions. In other words, is my website accessible, right? Do I have multiple ways for people to communicate with me when I'm creating this space? Um, you know, is it readable from multiple different kinds of technologies, right? Thinking about just when you're building things, thinking about things from multiple perspectives and taking the time to say, you know, uh, is this accessible? And asking yourself the right question. I always say, one of the things that is funny, you'll go to a place that has a great, accessible entrance, for example, or a website that's really accessible, but there's no sign. I always ask the question, where's your sign? In other words, if I'm a person for a disability looking for this, whether I'm looking for employment accommodations, educational accommodations, or access to a building or access to a website, how would I know where to go? And oftentimes there's not good signage. And so one of the things we also need to educate people on is like, what are the markers that you need to put so that people know where to go to find out what your processes are and how they can access your space in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, what about audible signals, visual cues on the signage as well?
Mhm. We're dealing with it right now. When I was uh, designing or building the website, you know, it also depends on financial, like, and everybody we've talked to, all the companies that we've asked help with, it's been like, oh, well, that costs like $1,000. That costs 1,500, and we're like, we'll get back to you. But I mean, I do as much as I can, but with my disability, the progression of it, I can't do what I once did. So I can only do so much, and then we have to delegate, push some of that stuff off.
Right.
But because it becomes too much anxiety and just frustration, and of course that affects other things going on in my life too. So.
And it goes back to that what we were discussing before, how uh, people in the disability community, if their only real option for sustainable uh, employment is to become entrepreneurs. And then the problem we face as entrepreneurs is, okay, now you have to pay for everything yourself because no one's going to support you.
I mean, you've heard us have issues with audio. You've seen us, not be able to do, we have the lights over here, I can't just move everything, all the time. And so it's a constant struggle with things. And like if other people are forced or not going to accept any of the harsh realities that people enable, and are just okay with, you know, that forces us to have to do stuff from home. But if we have to do things from home, we also have to have enough, not just the knowledge and the experience to do these things, but also the financial means to be able to make those things happen.
Yeah, the importance of grants is huge, and just building building from the ground up. You know,
Mhm.
you know, you go to that point that I mentioned earlier about an investment. Investing early makes profitable returns at the end because something that costs $100 now, let's say, will probably cost 200 with inflation and cost of living going up existentially. Will cost maybe 150, 200. Taking that leap of faith now and believing and betting on yourself now, to me, is the biggest uh, hope for you to move on and to get your biggest return.
Exactly. But it's a hard road whenever you're those speed bumps and that red tape of being able to having to prove that you need these things. You know, it's sad. And I mean, just for the experience of, so I've worked from home for years, but this is a whole new venture for him and I. So, and while we understand that absolutely the disabled community needs us to talk about these things, this platform is definitely needed. But if we can't, you know, get through the red tape and the things, the biases and things that are, hard for us to get around to make it happen, then,
Justifying
it's sad
disability.
how it might affect, or it does affect other people with, lower incomes or financial means, you know, the things that they might be able to do, but can't because of the hardships or not being able to get a hold of grants that you're speaking of.
Well, I think
Justifying.
one of the big things that you talked about, when we're talking about unemployment a lot, and part of the reason I want to let the audience know we're talking about it so much, let me give some numbers. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities in the United States is 70%. That number has remained constant for the past 2 decades, right? So let me put that in context, right? In the financial crisis of 2008, the real unemployment rate rose to about 15% overall. And that was the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s, which meant that if you had 85 able bodied people in a room and 15 of them could not get a job, that would be the greatest economic crisis in 70 years. But if you had 100 disabled people in the room, only 30 of them would have a job, and that's the norm. And part of that challenge is in the United States in particular, the way that the social welfare system designed to provide health care to people with disabilities through Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that interferes with your ability to work. So in order to get some access to like medications that you may need or things that you may need, you actually have to be underemployed for that to happen, right? So one of the big challenges is how do you help those with disabilities get the resources they need without defining them as not able to work, because it's difficult to work if the very definition that you need and in order to get the health insurance that you need is I can't work, right? That's one of the big challenges that people with disabilities face, plus the attitudinal barriers, plus in the United States, mass transit in most places in the United States is almost non-existent. There's about 60% of the country in which if you don't drive, it is going to be really difficult for you to get a job because it's going to be difficult for you to get to and from the job, right? And so things like that are structural things we don't think about, right? So one of the things we need to think about as people with disabilities is like, how can we align ourselves with the environmental movement, right? Because one of the things that would be helpful, right, in terms of global climate change is also to have better mass transportation, which would be good for the environment if people were driving less cars, but would also increase access for people with disabilities if we didn't rely so much on the automobile as our only way of transportation in many, many cities and counties and communities across the United States.
Cars seem to resemble control. If you've got a car, you have the control of where you want to be when you need to be there, as opposed to paratransit and transit in and of itself. And that's a whole other podcast for talking about transit. But
Right?
it's a challenge here in Ontario as well. I'm going to leave it at that. But to your point, Court, it's something that impedes the quality of life, impedes the activities of daily living. It seems to transition into our lives being gate kept. You should be happy that you have this rather than deserve it. Disability rights are human rights, and that often gets overlooked as well.
This has been a very wonderful. We've had a really good. Thank you guys for showing up here and talking with us.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
been a pleasure, Anthony, Court, and Danny. Whenever you see this,
Yeah, I don't know where she went, but thank you too.
Well, thanks,
um,
guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. This was fun.
thank you.
Thank you.
And for those watching, we're going to close off with a little graphic explaining more about our journeys and Under the Surface series podcast. So just hang on for a second. We're going to put that on the screen. But yeah, so we'll just throw some graphics up and we'll catch everyone later. Be sure to share this video and like our channel and all that stuff. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.